This is VikesNow, and we are past the regular season. We have the 14-3 Vikings. It actually feels like a strange week to be a little let down by the 14-3 Vikings because dudes on this show had them at 7-10 or 8-9. Frisky maybe 9-8. But the Vikings are heading to the postseason Monday Night Football, playing against the Rams, Kevin O'Connell's former employer. I have Josh Frey with me. We thought we were going to have a new guest, but he hasn't shown up yet. We shall see if he arrives mid-show. We're going to roll with it. Josh, we haven't talked to you in about a month, I believe. How are you?
I'm doing all right, other than that crappy loss on Sunday night. That definitely that sucked. That flat out sucked. I was expecting a really good game and it ended up not being that way. But hey, 14-3, it was a strong regular season. Of course, in the most Vikings fashion, that ultimately leads to a wild card spot and a road gauntlet through the playoffs. But this Vikings team, we'll talk about it, but I still think that they got a shot to make a run this January. So we'll see what happens. But ultimately, vibes are still high. Vibes are still high heading into the playoffs.
I don't know if you saw it, but part of Kevin O'Connell's post-game speech to the team, or at least he told the media about it afterward, was in 2021, his Super Bowl winning Rams, they had a shot to get, I think it was a number one or number two seed. I don't remember which one, if he clarified that, but they lost to the 49ers. And so then they had to be the three seed, which is a little better than the fifth seed. But there is precedent for the guy who leads this team to go on a run. We've seen it. The best case scenario is that somehow the other wild card teams close your ears, the Packers and the Commanders win, and then the Vikings would have some semblance of home cooking here in the tournament. All right, well, you had a nice little segue about this Lions game. It's kind of funny. I knew driving there as a Vikings fan for almost 30 years, that type of outcome is a possibility. So I was bracing for some kind of loss. I didn't think Sam Darnold would be utterly inept. But here's what I want to know from you, especially since I haven't talked to you since this win streak got up to 6, 7, 8, 9 games. Tell me about your jitters, if any, for this Vikings Rams game because of what we just saw in primetime on Sunday night.
Yeah, I mean, any Vikings team and any Vikings fan is going to have some sort of jitters come playoff time, just because history says that you better have jitters going into the playoffs. But I gotta say, like that Lions loss really seemed like an anomaly in my mind, at least. It was just like one of those things where if one or two things go the Vikings' way, that could be a very different game, and just nothing went the Vikings' way throughout that entire night. Like Jahmyr Gibbs was absolutely fantastic for the Lions. Hats off to him for a fantastic game. I think it was 180 yards and four touchdowns. Just that dude torched the Vikings defense, and they just had no answers for him. So that is, especially if the Vikings were to end up facing off with the Lions, whether it be in the divisional round or in the NFC Championship game, especially at Ford Field, that would definitely cause me some jitters. But I mean, at the end of the day, the biggest thing is just Sam Darnold has to get back on track, which I think is ultimately very possible. But
Mhm.
we haven't seen him. This is going to be his first time really playing in a playoff game. And we're going to really see what kind of cojones this guy has on him going into the playoffs for the first time. And that Sunday night game was absolutely rough, just overthrowing balls to Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson. That Jordan Addison throw in the game was an absolute killer. And I do think that we there's precedent for him getting back on track. You think back to that Jacksonville game where he throws those three interceptions, and then for the rest of the regular season, I think he had three for the final like 8 or 9 weeks of the season. So I do think that he can definitely get back on track. It's just in this type of environment, in the playoff environment, on the road, is he going to be able to do that in turning around in 1 week and do it? And then the other thing is obviously the kicking situation. That is probably my biggest concern heading into the playoffs, with Will Wagner missing another field goal last weekend. Then they have the kickoff gaff on top of it, and it just, for a rookie. Obviously, he's kicked in big games. He's an Alabama kicker. He's kicked in big games in the SEC, but NFL is still a different beast, and especially NFL playoffs are going to be a different beast. So again, we'll see what type of cojones this guy has on him as well. When push comes to shove, and this guy has to make like a 48-yarder to keep the Vikings either in it or maybe even win a game in the LA. But yeah, those would probably be my two biggest concerns. I think the defense is going to be just fine in this game. I know Brian Flores talked about it a little bit yesterday, but I mean, at the end of the day, I do think that my jitters ultimately come down to Sam Darnold and Will Record, and I think that both of them can do it. But again, Vikings history in the playoffs. Neither one of these guys have really played in the playoffs or a playoff situation in the NFL, so it's there's going to be some nerves going into that one for sure.
I joined First and Skull last night with Sal Spice, and I probably sounded like a broken record. I think I pounded home 4 times that there is a silver lining or a backdoor advantage that if Sam Darnold was destined to have a shitty game under the lights with all the pressure on him, somehow we got a situation where it wasn't a lose and go home. That is, if normal, let's say he just had that in his DNA and it was going to happen no matter what. Well, he got it out of the way, and the Vikings are still in the playoffs. Do you look at it that way, that he got on the job training in a playoff simulation? There was no delineation between the Lions game and a playoff game. I can vouch for it. I was there. Do you think that that can serve as a precursor to get the bad shit out of the way?
Kind of think so, and I mean, I definitely hope so. Because we've seen him all season. This dude has made big throws in big situations. You think back to the absolute ass kicking that they handed the Houston Texans, another playoff game early in the season, the game against the San Francisco 49ers. Obviously, the 49ers didn't end up being the team that we thought they were going to be, but at the
Mhm.
time, that was a really big game, and he came through and he made big plays when it needed to happen. That Packers game, the Bears overtime win, like this dude has definitely made big plays when it matters, in big situations. And I mean, you can say what you will about the Chicago Bears, but still, it's a
Yeah.
divisional game. That still counts as a big game in my mind. And the fact that he's able to come through in some of these situations, like obviously we're never going to say that Sam Darnold is like the franchise quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings moving forward. Like at least I don't think so. But I do think that this dude has shown all season long that he can make big throws when it matters, and he's able to get the ball to his guys. And I think that that's definitely a possibility this weekend. I think he can at least hang with the Los Angeles Rams this weekend.
There are some fans who returned to a familiar Viking spot that was like, gosh, on this huge stage, they didn't even show up to play, and therefore not as rosy or optimistic about the team for the first round of playoffs. I mean, it's on the road and we already lost there. So I want to know from you, because you watched presumably every snap of the Week 8 game, why is this Rams Vikings game? Why can this be different? How can this be different than the loss in late October?
Well, I think it can be different for a multitude of different reasons. Like, first and foremost, you think back to that game, that's a Thursday night game. That's
Hmm.
not a regular NFL situation. Like anything goes on Thursday night football. And the Vikings ended up coming up short in that one. And I mean, again, Brian Flores talked about it yesterday. That apparently the team was scrambling when Puka Nacua was activated for that game, which, I mean, isn't necessarily a great excuse because you're a defensive coordinator in the NFL. You need to be prepared for all of their guys to be on the field. But again, it's Thursday night football. Both him and Cooper Kupp were coming off of multiple weeks of not being on the field. So they were actually pretty well rested going into that game. Whereas the Vikings defense had just come off a game against the Detroit Lions where it was a hard fought game. They ended up losing that one. It's probably really emotional in the locker room afterwards. And I just think it was a very different situation than what we're heading into on Monday night, where both teams are going to be very rested. And you look even further, Blake Cashman wasn't on the defense for that game with the
Hmm.
Minnesota Vikings. I think he plays a big role in that defense. I think everybody thinks that he plays a big role in that defense, and having him on the field is going to be crucial heading into this first playoff matchup. And this defense, when he's on the field, has been absolutely fantastic. And even further, it's not just the defense, the offense. You look at it. TJ Hawkinson wasn't on the field for the Vikings in that game. They lost Christian Darrisaw in the middle of that game, and they were forced to throw David Questenberry out on the field. Now they've got Cam Robinson at left tackle, who at the very least has been a very serviceable starter for them.
Hmm.
So I think just the fact that Thursday night football, this is like completely different roster in a lot of ways for the Vikings heading into this one than it was in that Week 8 game. So I think that this can go very differently for the Vikings and go in their favor.
What I keep banking on, I do think the Vikings will win. My prediction is 27-21. Um, Here's what I look at. So DVOA, a metric that I trust, the Rams defense ranks 26th. That isn't good. Now it played well against the Vikings in Week 8. No doubt about that. Decent, I should say. And then their pass protect. DVOA doesn't grade pass protection, but Pro Football Focus does. The Rams for pass protection offensive line rank third worst in the sport. So you have on paper a shitty defense. At least per the numbers. When I watch them, it always feels like they're pretty decent. Jared Fisk and Jared Verse, Braden Fisk are pretty sweet young contributors. And then the offensive line is really anonymous. We thought going into the October game that we would feast. It was the one game of the entire season where there was zero pass rush, and that's why Matthew Stafford cooked. So I'm banking on those two facets: a generally poor defense, at least compared to the Vikings, and then an offensive line that most folks couldn't even name most of the guys. I think those work in the Vikings' favor. And let's face it, the Vikings have been more consistent, more balanced, and better than the Rams all season. And that's not a controversial take. We didn't think that back in September, but right now, over the span of 17 games, you earn that respect when you're 14-3. I haven't talked to you, sir, since Sam Darnold, I guess, exploded in clutch moments, went on this extraordinary December run. This is what he does. You pull his numbers. Historically, even when he was a bust, he played well in December. So he had the game-winning touchdown in Seattle. Looked brilliant against the Packers. And then, of course, we're not going to mention last Sunday, but that plays into this question. I don't really know. I think I know because it's probably going to be similar to my stance as a prediction foremost, and then a preference. Where do you stand on the ever-present and won't go away soon Darnold or McCarthy debate?
My prediction, I think it's JJ McCarthy in 2025, and honestly, I think that's ultimately my preference too. I At the end of the day, it probably comes down to what kind of money gets thrown at Sam Darnold, and that's probably still in flux over depending on what happens over the next few weeks here. But I mean, I look at it over the past few years. I think the Vikings have laid out this path just
Hmm.
absolutely perfectly. You look at it like obviously Kirk Cousins in Kevin O'Connell's first season, he was a starter. He wasn't going anywhere. And then they go 13-4. Like, obviously, you have to bring him back in 2023 and at least try to make a run at this thing. And then 2023 happens and everything goes absolutely sideways between the Cousins injury, Jefferson injury, all sorts of stuff happening. And then at the end of the day, like you look at it like the 2023 draft class, it didn't really seem like the Vikings were going to get a quarterback in that class. Unless they traded the farm away to go get an Anthony Richardson or something, like they weren't going to get a quarterback in that class, at least not a very premier starting quarterback. And looking at that 2023 draft class, they were probably right about that at this point in time. So I think that that's probably why a part of why they brought Kirk Cousins back as well as the 13-4 season. But after 2023, you look at it, you got all these quarterbacks in that draft class. This is the time after a disappointing season for the Vikings. You go strike and get a young QB at a cheap contract. You go get JJ McCarthy. He injures himself, but you bring in Sam Darnold on a $10 million contract. And I think that $10 million contract is a big reason why the Vikings have had as much success with Sam Darnold as anything else because if you bring back Kirk Cousins on whatever contract, you're not getting Andrew Van Ginkel. You're not getting Blake Cashman. You're not getting Jonathan Grenard for that defense. And that defense, those three guys have been arguably the best three guys on that defense all season long. So without those signings, I don't think that we're looking at this Vikings team in the same light that we are right now. And then you throw on top of it this upcoming offseason where Sam Darnold could go get a big contract depending on what teams feel about him after this playoff run. I don't think you go bring him back on big money when you can just throw in JJ McCarthy on another cheap contract and go use your cap space on more contributors around JJ McCarthy. So I think that the Vikings have laid this plan out perfectly over the past few years. And I think it would be very surprising to see them go away from that at this point.
Yeah, where I am at, any Darnold bring him back stuff for me. Only reason that I would say no thanks is because of money. And it's basically, in short, what you just said, because I kid you not, my friend, we spent 6 years of the Kirk Cousins era, and the only detraction on Kirk was that he was paid too much for a level of contribution. He's not a guy that could drag you to the postseason. And I don't know if Darnold is going to be sustainable at this pace, 36 touchdowns, probably something similar if he's with Kevin O'Connell, but we don't know. And right now we're getting this production at 10 million. And he's going to automatically, if they beat the Rams and he's back on track, he's automatically going to get 40 million from somebody. And I just don't think it's the Vikings. My main beef, and this goes in line with what you said about signing free agents, is right now the Vikings have about that luscious 75 million in cap space. That's great. But half the team is scheduled to hit free agency. So
Exactly.
it's not like, well, we'll sign Darnold back for 40 and then we're fine. We'll still go. No, you have to spend that money on bringing your depth guys back. And that's Byron Murphy. That's Cam Bynum. Those aren't even depth guys. So in theory, if they franchise tag Darnold or sign him to anything more than 20 million, you can probably kiss Cameron Bynum goodbye. You can probably kiss Byron Murphy goodbye. You're gonna have to use the draft or some bargain bin asshole. And I don't want them to do that. The plan has been very meticulously of a competitive rebuild, I think, is to start JJ McCarthy. We thought we'd have 5 years on this thing. Now it's 4 years because of the meniscus tear. And I want the team to surround themselves with free agents. They showed they could do that beautifully last offseason. Think of the possibilities of having McCarthy 4 years for cheap, and you're having a new free agent class every year like we just had. So I am a McCarthy no matter what personality. If they dink around and find a way to bring Darnold back because they're paranoid, that's fine with me. But I really hope they don't do it for north of 20 million, which I think the only reason his price would go down to less than 20 million is if he has another turd this Monday night. Do you agree?
I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
Sam Darnold is getting paid this offseason. And
What a all-in game for him. My God, on Monday.
yeah, seriously, like this game is going to make him literally tens of millions of dollars if he goes and shows up. But if he doesn't show up, it goes tens of millions of dollars in the opposite direction. It's ridiculous. But I think another interesting factor in this is Daniel Jones is still around.
Yeah.
Like if JJ McCarthy isn't ready week one, like who's to say that the Vikings don't bring Daniel Jones back on a cheap contract similar to Sam Darnold's and just throw him in there? Obviously, it's not the most exciting option in the world, but last March, Sam Darnold wasn't the most exciting option either for the
Hmm.
Vikings. And I am all in on Kevin O'Connell as being the quarterback developer. Like obviously the Josh Dobbs thing was exciting for a few weeks and then he tipped around, but I mean, what else has Josh Dobbs done in the NFL other than those 3 weeks with the Minnesota Vikings last season? What else has Nick Mullins done in the NFL other than what he's done with the Minnesota Vikings last season? I think that Kevin O'Connell is just absolutely fantastic at scheming a way for his quarterback to be comfortable in the offense. And I think if it comes down to it, Daniel Jones can do that. But that's another reason why JJ McCarthy has to be the guy going into
Hmm.
2025 and not Sam Darnold, because I think JJ McCarthy's just from what I've seen of JJ McCarthy, not only is he a proven winner, I just think he's better than Sam Darnold.
Yeah, me
And
too.
I think
I took some
I
heat about 3 weeks ago when the debate was getting really hot. I think it was after the Seattle game. I said the difference maker in this Darnold McCarthy debate for me is I know McCarthy's going to be good. So long as that knee is okay, it's only a meniscus, people. It's not an ACL. I know it's a guaranteed thing for me that he's going to be good, especially with this coach and in this system. And I think that's the wild card where some fans were like, well, who knows? The draft's a crapshoot. He could be a bust. I don't feel that way about McCarthy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the draft's a crapshoot, but I mean, at the end of the day, everything about the NFL is a crapshoot. Like injuries, anything can derail a team during the season. The free agency, like who knows? You could get a guy and then you could end up with a situation where he wants out like Hassan Reddick
Hmm.
every other week, or throw another name in there. Like everything in the NFL is a crapshoot, and it just comes down to just putting the right pieces together at the right time. And I think the Vikings have done that beautifully to throw in a young quarterback, to develop him and move forward, and getting a guy, again, a proven natural born winner like JJ McCarthy, just having him fall into your lap with that 10th overall pick last offseason. I think it'd be very foolish for the Vikings to waste that and stick with Sam Darnold on a bigger contract rather than maybe franchising him and trading him away later in the offseason as well.
Yeah, I think we have laid the framework. You're a weekly guest, maybe even twice a week when we get to the off season, because that's kind of the Super Bowl, believe it or not, for YouTube shows and content. I think this is going to be a very JJ McCarthy oriented show. So if you don't like that, Vikings fans, oh boy, you have to strap yourself in. All right, let's do some playoff predictions. Let's make these like 20, 30 seconds or less. My big upset of the week is the Steelers over the Ravens. I know that the line is like 10 points. But I swear to God, folks, this is the type of game the Steelers will sneak up and win because they've lost five straight or whatever. This rivalry is fantastic, and it's the type of game where the Steelers would nip them in the bud. So my upset pick is Steelers over Ravens. I don't expect you to agree, but what do you got, Steelers Ravens?
I'm leaning towards the Ravens just
Hmm.
because I just think that they've got too many weapons on that offense. Like Derrick Henry has come all the way back and just become an absolute monster again. I don't think the Steelers are going to be able to hang with them, especially with how their offense has looked over the past few weeks. So I got the Ravens in
Yeah,
that game.
if you're doing it based on momentum, stats, and pretty much everything, it is the Ravens. But I swear I've loved this rivalry since it became the rivalry, and this is the precisely the type of. It's almost like the Bears being 2-11 and the Vikings 11-2, and the Bears beating them anyway. That's the type of shit
Mm-hmm.
that happens. Who do you have? Chargers at Houston.
This is one of my upsets. I'm going with the Chargers in this one. I think Jim Harbaugh
Houston's
is just
favored?
I haven't looked at. I'm just basing that off of seeds,
Okay.
but yeah, I haven't actually looked at the lines yet. But I think that Jim Harbaugh is he's put this Chargers team together, and this has been one of the best seasons that Justin Herbert's ever had in the NFL. They've got their running game going again with J.K. Dobbins back in the lineup, who's just been massive for them all season long. Their defense is great. I think Houston's just on a downward stride. It's just not been a great year for them at this point. So I'm going with the Chargers.
Yeah, I don't have that same feeling about Texans that I do the Steelers, mainly because it's Chargers, Texans, and nobody really cares about that as a rivalry because it's not. I have the Chargers. Chargers are favored by 3, and I think that they are going to push the Bills or the Chiefs to the limit in the divisional round because that's what Harbaugh does. I don't know if I'm going to say it's going to call an upset when we get there, but they're certainly going to do that. Buffalo, Denver. I'm not a Bo Nix believer. I don't think you are either. He's posts some great numbers, but I think he's going to be one of those guys that returns to the stratosphere. Whether or not he's in Sean Payton's offense or elsewhere in 4 or 5 years, I just don't think he's that good, and therefore I think they can hang with the Bills because they do have a good defense. But I think the Bills end up winning by 14 or so.
Yeah, hats off to Sean Payton. I think he's put together a great offense around Bo Nix. I
Mhm.
agree. I don't think that he's necessarily the guy to go into a playoff run with, and I think Buffalo they've got a chip on their shoulder heading into this season after all the talk last offseason and just the playoff gaps in the past, and just that this was supposed to be like a rebuilding year for Buffalo, and now they're where they're at. So I think that Buffalo is going to stomp them this weekend.
All right. I have to give a message to Vikings fans. Packers, Eagles. I'm telling you, no matter how you dice it, it's fundamentally better if the Packers beat the Eagles. Now, I swear, once every 2 years, 3 years, there is a situation like this where it's better if the Packers win for the Vikings' sake. And it never works out for cheering because I quickly, like within 2 minutes, I'm like, I'm not cheering for these assholes. But this would be better. This would keep home field advantage alive to an extent for the Vikings. I still think the Eagles are going to beat the Packers. And I only think the reason that some of us are hesitant is the Packers last year beat the pants off the Cowboys and we didn't really expect it. But I don't think they'll do that this year. I have Eagles over the Packers by 10.
Yeah, this is a tough one for me because like the Eagles have been great all season, but all the crap that they've done all year long and between Nick Sirianni and just the AJ Brown, Jalen Hurts feud or whatever it's been, like eventually this is gonna come back and bite them. So I don't know if it's this weekend, but I mean for Vikings fandom's sake, I'm going with the Packers this weekend.
The weirdest sentence you'll ever say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. All right, so you have the Packers in a upset. Sweet. Another strange sentence, only because it keeps home field advantage alive for the Vikings. Interesting. Tampa Bay hosting the Commanders. This should be a fun game to watch. You never know what team you're getting when you watch the Buccaneers. They can beat the Panthers 48-14. They can almost lose to the Saints, who look like a train wreck against the Packers 2 weeks ago. Who do you have? I am taking probably the Bucks because it's a little too soon for the Commanders to get this good. What say you?
I think the Buccaneers are a team that can sneaky make a run to the NFC Championship game this year. So I'm taking the Buccaneers. I just think Baker Mayfield's been absolutely fantastic this season. And Jalen McMillan's looked ridiculous as their wide receiver opposite Mike Evans over the past few weeks too. So I think I'm going with the Bucks.
It's worth noting, Josh, that your predicted path here is actually pretty sweet for the Vikings, in my opinion, because
Mm-hmm.
you, in theory, hopefully, you'll predict that the Vikings beat the Rams on the road, and then a divisional round matchup at Tampa Bay is about the most advantageous division matchup you could ever dream up. Not because the Buccaneers are shitty or anything. It's just I would not fear that game in my heart of hearts. However, I will fear going to Philadelphia because the Vikings never win in prime time there. All right, so you have that, and then I am taking the Vikings 27-21 in the most important game for this show's sake. What do you got?
I'm going with the Vikings as well. In terms of a score, I'm probably leaning Vikings 24, Rams 17. I just don't think the Rams offense has been all that spectacular, basically since that Vikings game, other than their output against Buffalo. So I think that the Vikings are going to bounce back and pull this one off.
All right, my friend. And we said this last year. I remember talking about it because it just snuck up on us so quick. Or maybe that was 2022. I think it was 2022. We're either going to be talking about the offseason next Wednesday, or we're going to be previewing Vikings at Buccaneers, Vikings at Eagles, or Vikings at home versus the Commanders. Those are the stakes. Any of those could reasonably happen. It's so cool, this NFC field. Usually the 7th seed, especially sometimes even the 6th seeds feel like token, like, oh yeah, you had to include them. They ain't going to do nothing. But these teams feel somewhat formidable, which should make for a lot of excellent matchups.
It's yeah, this NFC slate is absolutely loaded, and
Mm,
like you take away if the Packers don't lose in Week 18, you're looking at 7 12-win teams in that conference, which
jeez.
is absolutely nuts.
That is. All right, man. We'll talk to you next Wednesday, either about the off season or the divisional round. Okay.
Sounds good, man. See you then.
Yep. Later.